Right, this is TriumphTragedy, European Balance of Power, 1936 to 1945, designed by Craig Basinski, published by GMT Games. And this is a sort of a epic sort of World War II sort of open kind of game where it covers a lot of the aspects of war, including the economy, diplomacy, of course your battles with the blocks, and the technology development aspect of it. So it's a really interesting game. It's a three-player game, and you have the Western powers, the Axis, and the Soviets. The Western powers start with Great Britain and France, with the option at some point in the game for the United States, which are the green units, to come out. But they're probably not going to come out until later on in the game, and they're going to contribute to the Western powers. So there's a lot of different types of World War II games out nowadays, but this one here is one of the interesting parts of this game. Is it is a three-player game. It can be played with two, but I think it's really designed to be a three-player game. So the game starts with everybody at peace, and it's quite possible in this game that nobody actually even ever goes to war. There's going to be a lot of incentive to go to war, though, because the Axis powers in the middle start out with a little bit of an advantage and a larger hand size, and I think if nobody decides to take them on, they're just going to walk away with the victory. So at some point war is going to break out, more than likely. But it's not, even though that in a lot of traditional World War II games you have the Western powers and the Soviets almost sort of working together against the Axis, the Western powers and the Soviets in this game, there's only one winner between the three factions. So even though they may at times be working together to sort of keep the Axis powers in check, they're really not friends of each other, and they could be that they go to war against each other. It could, in fact, be that they go to war with each other, and then Germany could actually stay out of the war completely. Probably unlikely, but that kind of thing can happen. So the game itself does not have to progress the way World War II actually progressed, which is pretty interesting. So there's a lot of open possibilities. You can win the game by getting a military victory by capturing a couple of capitals. You can win at the end of the game by just getting points based on how high your industry is, how many points you have in peace dividends. I'll get into that in a minute. And also how many steps on the atomic bomb that you have. You can also win the game outright by developing the atomic bomb. It's pretty difficult because you have to go through 4 stages of technology, but you can win that way too. So let's just kind of get into the gameplay of it. The turn order in the game is interesting. You roll a die, and that number determines who starts in the direction of the play. So I rolled a 3. So in this case, let's just imagine I rolled a 2. Because I want to, the Axis powers are right here, I just want to kind of start with them. So if I rolled a 2, that means the Axis powers are going to start, and then the turn order is going to go around in a circle. And after each year, a new die is rolled, and you never really know who's going to start the turn order, so that's pretty interesting. At the beginning, you start with advancing the year, and people who are at peace get a peace dividend if they haven't been in any battles and such, and the peace dividends give you points at the end of the game, but most of them are zeros. Some of them are 1s, a few of them are 2s. So you can collect these during the game. There's a little bit of an incentive to sort of stay at peace for a little while at least and collect some of these peace dividends. But you never know the point value someone may have in the game at any given time. So even though you can see where they may stand in terms of victory points on the board, you never quite know because you don't know the value of the peace dividends. And I think that's a good factor of the design. So you don't really quite know how many points a person may have at a given time. So anyways, now we go into the production phase. After we do the years and the victory checks and the turn order stuff, we now go into the production phase. And in the game, the level of production for each country is determined by these three factors here. You have your industry, you have your population, and you have the resources that you have access to, and all of these determine your production. Now, we start the game at peace, and you can see that the resources are green and are gray, and they have a sort of a green laurels around them, because these are not a limiting factor. It's sort of assumed in peacetime you can trade goods around the world and get the resources you need. However, once you go to war, this flips and becomes black. It becomes a limiting factor. Now, your production is the lowest of these three markers that are black, so this would not count right now. Germany right now is a production level of 11 because that is the lowest of these three markers. So they get to spend 11 points to do whatever they want, the different types of things that they can do with the production. And one of the really nice things about this game is it is very, very streamlined. It's one of the most streamlined games I've really come across, especially for a game like this. Well, a lot of games that have a historical feel tend to have a lot of different, very specific rules to sort of simulate the sort of historical events and stuff. The way this game simulates that is not through creating more complex rules to simulate some of the historical characteristics of that time period. What it does, it accomplishes that through the dynamic of how these countries play out their diplomacy and sort of the ebb and flow of what's going on the board. Because it is a competitive game between the three countries, there are times when one country may be pulled into war by another just to try and prevent that other third country from getting too far ahead. So there's an interesting dynamic that plays out. It creates sort of a historical feel, even though the game itself does not have to unfold the way the war actually went. But it has these interesting dynamics that I think, are very much in play during the time period. But anyways, right now Germany has a limiting factor of 11, so I can do these things. I can build new units. I'm not going to really go into the differences between the units, but there is a whole bunch, and this isn't even all of them, but there's a whole bunch of different types of units. And they have different capabilities, different strengths, different weaknesses in battle, different uses. I can build any of those units I want at a cost of 1 point. So maybe I want to build one of these tanks. So that's one of my points. Maybe we'll raise some of these up. They should all be on 1 here. So raise up to 2. Raise this one up to 2. Raise this one up to 2. I already left it on 2 by accident. This one up. I think I just did 4 or 5 points there, and then another thing I can do is buy cards. There are two different types of cards. There are these action cards, which can be used for diplomacy and combat or army movement sort of operations, military operations here. So I can buy those at the cost of 1 point per card. I can also buy investment decks and cards, and these cards have factories on them that will help me build up my industry, and each country has a different number that they need to build up industry. So for example, right now Germany needs 5, so I need 5 points. So 2, 3, 4, 5. These 3 cards make 5. I could use them, if I buy these cards, to build my industry up 1 level. They also have technologies on them, and usually on 2 sides is a technology. There's also some other cards that have some special powers on them. But for example, if you can get a matching pair of technologies, you can place them together. For example, here we go. 2 rocket artilleries can be placed together, and you can develop a technology with 2 matching cards. So those are useful for that. So let's say I buy 5 of these. Oh, let's buy 6 of them. So that gets me to my 11. I kind of lost count of how many steps I did, but so Germany goes to their Axis goes to their production phase, and then it goes to the Western powers. They do all of their production, and then the Soviets do all of their production. Once we've done that, we go to the next phase. This is the government phase. This is a phase where you're going to be able to play these cards that you bought. Now, I'm going to start with the industry cards. Maybe the Axis powers, maybe they want to play a technology. So they want to develop this technology. I have 2 choices. I can play it and play the card face up. Show that I've got the 2 and discard 1, play it face up, and then that is a technology that I can use at any time, and everybody knows I have it. And it will not count against my hand size. The other option is to put the 2 together, turn it over face down, and keep it in a secret vault so that nobody knows what I have there. There are some sort of espionage type of cards that let people kind of spy on what you might have there. But for the most part, I keep it secret. The only problem with that is it counts against my hand size. In Germany, the Axis powers right now have a hand size of 7. You'll notice I have way more than 7 cards. That only comes into play at the end of this phase. So I have to be down to 7 cards at the end of this phase or I lose all of the extras that I have. So the Axis is going to play that down. So now their hand size is actually 6 right now. Then the Western powers go. Maybe they've played it. Maybe they play out some industry cards and go up on their factories. Then the Soviets go. They do the same thing. Comes back around to Germany, and they decide to play 5. So let's do this: 2, 3, 4, 5. That adds up to 5, and I can go up my industry 1. Now remember, I'm still limited by my population, but I am building up my industry in hopes that I may be able to build up my population later. And I'll show you, we'll be getting to how you can build up your population and resources in a minute here. So it goes around again. We'll say everybody does, sort of the same thing here. Now it comes back around to the Axis, and now they want to start maybe playing some of these cards. These cards are a little bit different. Some of them have some special one-time powers on them you can do, but for the most part, these action cards have 2 countries on each side. Now these are used for diplomacy, and these will allow you to get influence on the neutral countries around the world here. So this one has Austria. Now if I was really going to play this, I'd probably try to find how many matching cards I have, because the more influence you have on a country, the more it's going to be, the stronger the link, which is always a good thing. And if you can get 3 influence on a country, it becomes a satellite. And I'll kind of get into that in just a minute. But for the most part, I'm going to be playing cards out. I'm probably going to want to look at what I have a lot of. For example, did I see another Romania? Yeah, I think I have 2 Romanias. All right. So that's kind of interesting. So, I may start playing out cards. I may start out with something like playing out in Austria. Now, that's my turn. It goes over to the Western powers, and they kind of see that I've played out in Austria. Now they can play out any card of their choice. They get 2 Swedens here, which they're going to keep an eye on. But they don't want me to have Austria. So maybe they play out an Austria card, and what happens is someone plays another card out that matches, they both cancel, and they go away. Soviets' turn, and they've decided they want to start playing some of these diplomacy cards too, and they put out a influence on Greece. Back over to the Axis power on his side. They're going to try and go for Romania. They got a couple cards here. They want to see if they can get some more. Then the Western powers go, and they want to start getting some influence in the United States. They play that out. And the Soviets, maybe the Soviets, they have some industry cards. I want to play those right now or something. They could also pass at any time. That doesn't mean they're out of the round. They can pass, and then maybe it comes back to the Axis power. I'm going to play another Romania, and then the United States goes, and they want to start getting maybe a Sweden out. And it comes back to the Soviets, and they decide this round that they want to play, back in on the game again, and they play another Greece. play continues until all three countries have passed. So you can kind of pass and come back into the game as long as the other two nations haven't passed. Other two powers haven't passed. So, obviously, the Axis powers are not going to pass at this point. They've got way too many cards here. But let's assume that there's a bunch of cards are out, and we've got sort of this result. Now, once everybody's passed, then what we do is we resolve these diplomacy cards. Now, the way that works is, right now, all the cards that haven't been canceled are out on the board. So right now, the United States is going to get an influence on, the Western powers are going to get an influence on the United States, which is good for them. They want to start getting some influence there. The Axis powers get 2 influence on Romania. Now, when you get an influence on a country, let's just use Romania for example. Let's say I got 1 influence. Romania has a triangle on it that says 2. That means 2 resources. And once I get an influence, I get that right away. So I get 2 resources from Romania, and it also has a city here. And if you look on this chart here, that city contributes 1 population. So there's my population. I get that from just 1 influence. So why would you want to put more influence? Well, when you have 2 influence, I want to look at, make sure I have the term right. I believe it is called a protectorate once it has 2 influence. And the advantage of that is you still get the resources and population, but now, if any country decides to attack Romania, it is the same as attacking the Axis powers. We now have an agreement, sort of a defensive pact here, that if Romania gets invaded, it's a declaration of war on the Axis powers. Whereas if there's only 1 influence, if the Soviets wanted to invade, let's say they invaded here, and they defeat Romania, that does not make us at war. It does not make the Soviets and the Axis powers at war. So that area is a little bit more vulnerable with just 1 influence on it to just being outright taken over militarily, whereas 2 becomes a little bit more of a deterrent. Because when you declare war on another power, what happens is you actually make the cost of their industry go down 1. So if the Soviets invaded that now with 2, the cost of the Soviets to build a factory is now going to be 4 because they declared war on us and have attacked Romania. Now, if you were able to get 3, let's say we've gone through this round and we've gone through all the other phases of the game and we've gone through another round, another year, and we've come back to diplomacy, and I managed to get 1 more influence there. If I get 3, what happens is I flip over the token, and this becomes a satellite of the Axis powers. And I immediately get some cadres, level 1 units of my choice, depending on the population here. So they have that city has a muster of 2. That means I will get 2 cadres of my choice. Maybe I'm going to choose a infantry and a plane. And I get to put those out, and those are units that I can use for the Axis powers. So getting a satellite is excellent. You can add to you militarily, and just adds more to your military, and obviously your economy is also benefiting by that. So countries are going to be building up influence on these. The powers are going to build up influence on different neutral countries around the world, and some of them are worth more than others. Spain has got a pretty large military to muster if you can get it. So does Turkey. Other areas have different levels of population or different levels of resources. Some have sort of more strategic significance, being on the borders of your country that you might want to have, and so forth. So as the game goes on, you're going to see some countries begin to turn and be drawn into the sort of taking sides here in the conflict, which I think is really interesting. And, you know, depending on what you invest in your action cards, you kind of have, you know, some control over how that goes. You can invest pretty heavily in the diplomacy at the cost of your technology and industry development. So it just kind of depends on how you want to go. Of course, if you invest too much in one area, you're going to be weak and vulnerable in another. So if you invest heavily in the diplomacy and don't build up your military, someone may come and obviously come and attack you and take advantage of that. So that's one of my favorite parts of the game, is the way the diplomacy plays out with these cards. I think it's really excellent. It works really well. So after the government phase, we check our hand sizes and such, and then we go into the seasons. And this is another kind of interesting part of the game. There are different seasons in the game. You start with a spring operation, then a summer, then you check for blockades, a fall, and then a winter. So how that works is you go to spring first. And if you have some leftover cards, some of these action cards, you remember that they have different, in the middle here, this is what these operations are for. So I have fall, I have a summer, a spring, and a summer. So let's just say this is the Axis hand right now. Right now we're in spring. If I want, I could play this spring operation. And this is a B4. So I would play that face down. I'm the first player, so I play that face down and say I'm going to declare that I'm going to be playing a card here for the spring. And then the Western powers may go, and they may say, I don't like that the Axis is doing that. I'm going to play down a spring operation. And maybe the Soviets say, oh, we're going to pass. So then we flip the cards over, and we look at them, and the letter higher in the alphabet goes first. So right now the B goes before the L. So the Axis power gets to move 4 units on the board. Now, if I move in peaceful territory, that either in oceans or in areas where I control, I can move double the movement, but normally you just move your units according to their movement, and there's a chart here that tells you the movement. Some of the movements are 3, some of them are 2. And I would get a chance to move my units. Now, it's a little early in the game, I haven't really built up my units, but if it was, say, later in the game, and I have some built up units, maybe I want to invade France, and I can move 4 units right now. Maybe I'll move 3 units here, and maybe a 4th unit here. And I declare that I'm going to be violating neutrality on the Western powers and invading France, for example. I can do that with my operations. And then we would resolve combat by rolling some dice. I'm not really going to go into that, but it's typically how a block game would be resolved. You just do 1 round of combat for that season. Okay? So then it's the Western powers. They kind of anticipated maybe that was going to invade, and they played a spring operation. They have 5 movements, so maybe they move out some units to begin to try and help out here, and move something in there to help out, and maybe put their ship out at sea. I don't know how many, 4 units or something like that, and they move something else. So they move. Now, then on their command, they can decide if they want to activate this area where there's a battle going on and do another round of combat. They do not have to. If they activate it, though, they become the attacker, and attacking you have a little bit of a disadvantage in combat because your units actually shoot second, the matching units in it, like in a typical block game, Columbia game. But anyways, I'm not going to go into that combat system too much, but they have the choice of activating that area and doing another round of combat if they want. They don't have to. So then spring's done. Then we go to the next season, which is summer, And we can determine if we want to play another card. Maybe the Axis power wants to play a summer operation. Maybe they do that. Maybe the Western powers want to also, but they don't have a card. And if you don't have a card for that time, maybe they have a spring card, you can play any card you want, but it becomes what's called an emergency operation, and it has a reduced value, and you cannot violate neutrality and start combat with that card. But you can move units around. So maybe they'll do that. And so forth. So you play through each of the seasons. And then there's a winter season in which the Soviets only can play a card, and they move units within the Soviet Union. So they get an extra season to maneuver in the Soviet Union. And then after the seasons are done, basically that's the end, and you come back to a new year, the year moves up, and you repeat the process again. And that's basically how the game flows. So, what do I like, what do I dislike about the game? One of the things that I really enjoyed about this game quite a lot is how streamlined it is. And I mentioned earlier that a lot of games, especially with war games and historical games, a lot of war games tend to not be super streamlined because they're trying to capture some historical flavor, and a lot of those games do that by having a lot of specific rules for certain situations in it. But this game is extremely streamlined, and it's so streamlined that I think this game would appeal to a lot of people who have no interest in war games in general, but like sort of maybe some empire building type of games, even though this really isn't. I mean, it sort of feels like an empire building game in a lot of ways. It's got a lot of the aspects of it. So the game is very easy to learn and very streamlined in that sense, that it could appeal to, you know, a pretty wide audience in that sense. I like that everything costs one production point. You don't have to look at a bunch of charts to figure out what costs what. Everything costs one thing. And all the units, no matter what they are, cost one thing. And it just makes it so much easier to play and so much less to keep track of. It's very streamlined in that sense. And intuitive. So that's a real big plus. And you know, even though it's very streamlined, like I said, sometimes these games sacrifice something historically to make it streamlined. But the dynamic of the game is very interesting. Like, for example, let's say the Axis powers have built up a lot and they begin invading France, okay? They're getting units in here, maybe they've gone through here, and they're making a push on France. If the Western powers fall, and the Axis power is able to capture Paris and London, they can end the game. So the Soviets, who may not be terribly upset that the Western power is getting beat up on a little bit, at some point is going to say, if I don't slow the Axis powers down, they're just going to trample on the Western powers and win the game. So they may have to be forced to invade at some point just to try and slow down, you know, what's going on the board. So they may just get drawn into the war, which I think is really interesting. That it's sort of almost a built-in dynamic, because the Axis start out stronger than the Western powers and the Soviets, and so they have a big advantage at the beginning. They also have a larger hand size, not a hand size, but a larger card draw of these action cards at the beginning of the game, so they can start putting out some influence immediately onto the board faster than the other factions, and begin to build up their resources and population right away. So if no one sort of checks them, they have a little bit easier time probably moving up on the industry and population and resources, so they could outright win an economic type of a victory if left unchecked. So it draws in the other parties into the game to kind of offset that. And at the same time, if the Axis get beaten up, you know, really badly, then it's going to be the Western powers and the Soviets are going to be starting to look at each other and start thinking, well, I got to start slowing you down in some way. So what am I going to do? And there's for the Soviets, there's this sort of juicy population center over here in India and Persia and stuff to start going after, and then maybe perhaps the Middle East, which is very tempting, and they have some access to that over there where they could start going after that if the Western powers look like they're starting to get ahead, or maybe they just want to do it for themselves anyways. So there's an interesting dynamic and sort of story that develops with this game, which I find is very interesting. So it really does a pretty good job of covering, all the dimensions that you would expect in sort of a kind of a World War II game that covers, the diplomacy and the economics and the technology. And the technologies I think are pretty interesting. And I really like the secret vault, how you can play a secret technology face down. And, there is it has a cost to doing that. It reduces your hand size, which I think is interesting to keep it secret. And the technologies are interesting, but, they're worth having, but they're not too overpowered either at the same time. And once they're revealed, it's easier for other countries to see and study that and get access to that technology themselves with the right types of investment cards. So the game works really, really well. I have to say I was really, really impressed with it when I got the chance to play this. I had played, I think, about 4 games with 3-player, and I did get a chance to play a game with 2-player. And the game with 2-player was okay. It's got some rules to sort of keep it, like one player will play the Soviets and the Western powers, and it's got some rules to keep it so that you can't do too much with one or the other. One of them becomes an active power on the turn, and the other one's more passive, which limits what you can do. But it's kind of a, even though it works okay, it is a little more. It's not really. I don't think it's not really designed from the ground up to be a 2-player game. So that's what I'm trying to say. So when it comes to 2-player, it's okay. It's still playable, but there are probably other types of block games that you might want to play before you, jump into this as a 2-player. There's another game that has that sort of grand scale World War II stuff called Victory in Europe, and I've actually enjoyed that game quite a bit too. Victory in Europe is definitely a longer game, and it has more, it seems more focused on sort of the combat and those kinds of things. There's more maneuvers and different types of combat operations you can do in that game, whereas this one is sort of much more simple in that terms. But the combat in this is still very good. And the diplomacy aspect in Victory in Europe, I think that these cards are an interesting way to do the diplomacy. In Victory in Europe, you have more of a die roll. You get to make a die roll for some influence. And then you get those blocks come out on your side in Victory in Europe. So the probably as a 2-player game, Victory in Europe is probably a better pure 2-player game. But if I was going to go 3 players, I might definitely consider playing this one. And the length of this one is shorter too. So I've enjoyed both games, but this is interesting as a 3-player. I tend to not have as many opportunities to play a 3-player game, which is unfortunate, but when I do, this is one that I would definitely want to try to get out. So overall, it's an excellent game. There's not too much negative I can really think of to say about it. I've seen the game end in a variety of ways, and I think that's really encouraging. I've seen country win by just pure the economics at the end of the game. I've seen countries win by military. I haven't seen anybody win by building the atomic bomb yet. I've seen games where somebody stayed completely out of the war, while the other two kind of fought. I've seen, no two games have played out the same yet, and I think that's really encouraging. So that's a positive sign, I think, for it. It has just so many cool dynamics going on. Overall, it's a great game. It's really enjoyed it, and I would definitely recommend it for people. All right, let's check out what the geek says here. And before I even start checking out some of these, I just wanted to look at some of the length of some of these responses. Look at the length of comments that people have about this game. A lot of these comments are just loaded with stuff to say about the game. I really haven't come across a game that's got this level of in-depth comment in it. For good or for bad, some of the ones towards the bottom here, even from people who didn't like the game, certainly had a lot to say about it. Very interesting. Anyways, I wanted to kind of go back up here towards the top to Chris Farrell here. And let's see here. Starting in here, I really enjoyed playing this and found it as engaging as anything I've played in the past few years. For a game of this type, it's quite fast playing, elegant and streamlined, creating a ton of great historical flavor with little fuss. And I just want to stop there and just say, yeah, it's because this game is so streamlined and it just plays so smoothly, and I think that's a great quality for this game. I love the early game with the jockeying for positions in Europe as you head towards general war, ratcheting up the tension once war breaks out. The rules are simple, but the command and technology cards nicely encapsulate a lot of nuance. It should be said too, it's possibly that World War II may never break out, and it's possible to play an entirely non-military game. However, the incentives of the game are strongly skewed towards war. The blocks tend to make wargamers conservative and gun-shy, but at some point around 1939 or 1940, it becomes obvious that if peace prevails, one player is going to win, and the only answer is military action. I think that's very true. I want to just continue on a little further here. I've seen complaints about the historicity of the game, but I actually find TriumphTragedy to be among the most historically interesting and evocative games on that period I've ever played. And I've kind of seen, I was reading through some other comments, and maybe I'll pull up one of those later, about someone who actually felt the game was not very historical at all, and then I see this comment here saying that it is very historical. And I think you can make that argument both ways. I mean, I can understand why someone says who wants to play out the actual history of the war won't like TriumphTragedy, because it can go any number of ways and sort of be ahistorical. But in the same sense, though, to get a real feel for the time period and actually play with some of the issues and things that are going on, the open-ended nature of this, and the way that there's you have the political maneuvering, and you have the technology, and you have all of these different factors in the game kind of going on, it kind of actually gives you sort of a little bit of a feel for some of what was going on, in the time period, as far as what could play out. I mean, it's not historically accurate in the way that the game plays out, but it sort of sets up this sort of pool, or sort of a sandbox, where there are these issues in the game that are kind of going on, and people were very reluctant to want to get into a war again and they sort of let Germany build up and kind of look the other way for a while. And so Germany starts out with a lot of these advantages kind of early on, and you get this kind of, it's just a neat way that it plays out. And I think it is very explorative of the historical period. So, you could say it's not historical at all because it doesn't play out like the war does necessarily. But on the other hand, you could say, well, in a way, it kind of gives you a different way to kind of explore that time period and how things could have unfolded. So I think that's really neat. All right, here's a comment from Ron Draker, the designer of Victory in Europe, which is that's a little bit different take on sort of a similar type of a game, similar genre. Terrific design with easy to learn rules, but hard to master strategy. This is one of my favorite World War II grand strategy games of all time. I was a little disappointed in the map and card artwork, but the gameplay makes up for it. So, I totally agree. This is from someone who plays a lot of these types of games, knows a lot about them, and has designed some himself. So that's quite a ringing endorsement. I do agree that the map artwork leaves a little bit to be desired. It's kind of too bad that it doesn't have more of a better visual presentation, but the gameplay certainly does make up for it. I would love to see another version of this game come out with a kind of an updated, more sort of a deluxe map type of version. That would be really great. But the gameplay certainly makes up for it. It's an excellent, excellent game. Okay, Commander Overbite has some really good insights here. My gold standard for 3-player war games is Maria, as I think is for a lot of people. This is not quite at that level, but it's not far off, and it could get there. 2 interlocking sub-games. The military side is grand strategy with only the broadest strokes with regard to military maneuvering. Maybe a minus for some folks, but works for me. Likewise, the diplomatic game is a pretty straightforward card game with significant press your luck elements. I think that's a pretty good description of it. The military part is it represents the large military movements, not the smaller little movements that you get with other types of war games, but it keeps it streamlined. Okay, Kamek says, I want to like this game very much. Unfortunately, it does not work for me and my group. It is like playing fantasy war game on a map of Europe. I am missing any historical setup regarding influence, like Czechoslovakia ties to France, and many other examples which are completely absent, and the game tries to persuade us that anyone could join alliance with any big power. This creates quite a lot of problems. Germany starts with the biggest hand, so automatically it means that it will come strongest from the initial diplomatic phase. And that's true. If you're looking for a historical representation, this isn't it. However, it kind of sets the, if you remove sort of the some of the maybe political issues that pertain from country to country, it does have a neat, interesting dynamic with how diplomacy plays out. And you just have to imagine that maybe, in this other alternate universe, that maybe some of these historical facts and ties were a little bit different and represented by how you're playing out the diplomacy cards. I think it's a really nice part of the game, but if you want a historical simulation, this is not it. As far as accurate historical simulation. If it was to be historically accurate, the rule book would be probably 5 times as long, and there would be all kinds of broken down rules to simulate some of these historical nuances. And there are plenty of games that sort of do that type of thing, but there's not very many games that produce such a kind of beautiful streamlined effect like this game does. So I think there's room for this game, but it's not going to appeal to people who are really wanting or expecting a historically accurate simulation. So, Kamex is correct, and it's a really good point, and it sort of depends on what you're looking for in the game. The historically accurate game, you're really going to have to look somewhere else. But if you want that streamlined effect that kind of leaves things more open-ended. This could be a game you should probably take a look at. All right, take care.